is the effect of censorship, of dogmatism, of intimidation. So both of these come from BarackObama.com, a website I will admit I don't spend a lot of time perusing. On BarackObama.com, the President of the United States is issuing a call out the climate deniers. Too many of our elected officials deny the science of climate change. Along with their polluter allies, they are blocking progress in the fight against climate change. Find the deniers near you. Find the heretics and call them out today. And indeed, they show a number. And I will say, when I first looked at that chart, I was quite disappointed. I thought I was omitted, but then I discovered I am indeed included, along with a number of other elected officials. Indeed, I might note a number of elected officials. What does it do to scientific debate when anyone who dares question political ideology is branded a denier and a heretic? What are the consequences in the academic world when that occurs? Dr. Curry.
There's a chilling effect, okay? People keep their heads down. They look for opportunities just to do something else and to move on, retire, get out of the business. I've talked to any number of scientists who have done this, recent PhD recipients on up to very senior scientists. It has a very chilling effect. As a tenured scientist who's relatively senior, I felt sufficiently secure to speak out. But younger scientists who are not tenured, fear for their jobs. They have mortgage payments, whatever, and and kids to support. They can't afford to speak out. The social contract currently between the Obama administration and climate scientists is, if you say alarming things, you'll get plenty of funding. That seems to be how it's working. And that is very, very pernicious for science.
And do you get funded if you're researching anything other than the orthodoxy of global warming alarmism?
I'm no longer applying for government grants. I can't get funded to do anything I want.
Let me speak more in the aggregate. Does one get funded if one is a scientist and one, I recall being back in high school and studying science, the scientific method, that you started with an hypothesis and then you look to evidence to prove or disprove the hypothesis, and often disproving it is the more useful thing to try to do. Do those who are actually trying to disprove the hypotheses, mind you, the hypotheses that will drive up the electric bills and the cost of living for millions of Americans, will hurt people who are struggling, will hurt single moms, will hurt Hispanics, will hurt African Americans. Does anyone doing any research that might contradict the political dogma, are they at all likely to get funding?
Okay, the issue is this. The funding agencies do a call for proposals or an announcement of opportunity, and they're already implicitly assuming that human-caused climate change is dangerous, that there's not even an opportunity or something that even makes sense to write, to submit a proposal to. Right. So that's the real problem. So a lot of the skeptical research is really being conducted by independent scientists who are not asking for any government funding.
Okay, so my final two questions. One of the letters that the minority has submitted into the record is a letter from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. A sentence within that letter: we are committed to the principle that scientific inquiry and open scientific communication, regardless of field of study, should proceed unhampered by intrusions on academic freedom. Now, that is a noble-sounding statement and one that with which I agree emphatically. I want to ask the members of the panel, how does that noble sentiment comport with the call from our colleague, Democratic Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, that anyone who dares dispute the global warming alarmist orthodoxy should face criminal prosecution under RICO? Are those two statements somehow compatible, that you can have academic freedom and robust debate when you've got politicians saying we will criminally prosecute you as a racketeer if you dispute our political orthodoxy?
Well, that statement by science is the AAAS is really a myth, because about 2 months ago, well, maybe 3 months ago, the editor of Science, Marcia McNutt, had an op-ed in Science that said, "The debate is over. Urgent action needed," essentially. And this was the editor of Science, which is the flagship journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. When an editor of a scientific journal makes a statement like that, it gives all of the editors a license to completely ignore any publication that's submitted that questions a consensus. And this is the real pernicious thing that's going on. So right now, we're more ruled by the RICO mentality than we are by those lofty sentiments expressed by the American Association for the Advancement of Science.
Senator, you said your parents were, I think, mathematicians, statistical modelers. We've had a lot of talk today about climate science. I compiled a book that you were kind enough to mention the title of, and what was fascinating me about that book was that climate science evolves. 20 years ago, it was basically a branch of, 30 years ago, physical geography. Now it's basically computer modeling. Yet at the same time, the majority of statisticians who look at the climate models think they are grossly unprofessional. Mathematicians and statisticians who look at the way these climate models and the way the hockey stick were constructed are not on board with it at all. A majority of engineers are not on board with it. A majority of physicists, non-climate physicists, are not on board with this. So this idea that climate science is this hermetically sealed specialty that is sealed off from the rest of the world is nonsense. Climate science, you have dendrochronology types, you have statistical modeling types, and there are elements of all in the work that they do. But certain people, mathematicians, engineers, statisticians, are not on board with this. And Judith mentioned Science magazine. Nature magazine went even further. They're the two most prestigious science journals on the planet, Nature and Science. And Nature printed a statement recently from a group of climate scientists who said, quote, "Climate justice," unquote, "climate justice is more important than democracy." So that the fake 97% consensus is no longer enough. The fake 97% consensus of so-called climate scientists now has to trump the 51% of the electorate. No science in history has conducted itself like this, and it would be unrecognizable to Sir Isaac Newton or Charles Babbage or the Curies to see a self-sustaining, malign, politico-science nexus supporting itself and excluding all other voices. It is at odds with scientific inquiry across the centuries.
In 2009, August 31st, 2009, then Senator John Kerry, as I discussed in my opening, said scientists project that the Arctic will be ice-free in the summer of 2013, not in 2050, but 4 years from now. The nice thing about this is, unlike theories that can't necessarily be disproven, this is actually a statement that can be tested by actual facts and evidence. Dr. Happer, was it in fact accurate in the summer of 2013 the Arctic was ice-free?
No, it certainly wasn't ice-free, but if I could follow up on something my colleague just said, actually, this is not unprecedented in climate science. If you look in the Soviet Union for 30 years, it was reigned by Lysenko in biology. And he had a complete control over biology. You got fired or worse if you didn't agree with his brand of biology. And that was finally brought to an end, partly because of people from other fields. For example, Andrei Sakharov, the inventor of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, led some of the opposition because he had enough stature to stand up and push back. But most people were afraid. So there was a state of fear that was actually quite a bit worse than climate right now, but nevertheless, it's a good lesson to remember.